rhythmic thud of the hydraulic press usually felt like a heartbeat. But today, it sounded like a countdown. Linda stood frozen in the suffocating heat of the steel plant, her thumb tracing the jagged red eviction stamp on the crumpled notice hidden in her palm. Through the haze of iron dust and dancing welding sparks, she watched her husband, Tom, across the factory floor. He wasn't working. He was huddled in the shadows of a rusted turbine, surrendering a thick envelope of cash to a man whose face remained hidden behind a glowing cigarette. When Tom caught her eye, he didn't look afraid. He smiled, a slow, practiced mask of normalcy that didn't reach his frantic eyes. He mouthed the words, "It's handled," just as the plant's overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the massive workshop into a terrifying, unnatural silence. In the sudden dark, the only sound was the heavy metallic clank of the factory's main gates being chained shut from the outside. Linda reached for her wrench, her knuckles white, realizing that the man she shared a bed with was no longer the person she was trapped with. The lunch bell clanged through the din of the assembly line, but Linda didn't stop. Her fingers, calloused and quick, tightened the last bolt on the transmission housing before the conveyor jerked it away. The foreman's whistle cut through the noise, sharp, insistent. But she pretended not to hear, wiping grease from her palms onto the thighs of her coveralls. The fabric was stiff with old stains, the knees worn thin from years of kneeling on the concrete floor. "McCoy!" His voice cracked like a whip, closer now. She exhaled through her nose, counts to 3, then turns. The foreman's face is flushed, the veins in his neck standing out like ropes. "You deaf or just stupid? Break's over." Linda didn't flinch. She reached for the next housing, her shoulders aching from the weight of the wrench. "Clock's still ticking, isn't it?" The words came out flat, but her grip on the tool tightens. The foreman steps into her space, close enough that she smells the stale coffee on his breath, the sour tang of his sweat. His boot scuffs against the floor, kicking up a fine dust of metal filings. "You think you're special?" His laugh is a dry, humorless thing. "Every damn one of you thinks you're special." She didn't answer. The line doesn't stop for arguments. The next housing slides into place, and she bends over it, her back protesting. The foreman lingered for a second longer, then spits, "Put!" onto the concrete before stalking off. Linda watched the dark stains spread, then turned back to her work. The wrench fits into the bolt with a satisfying click. The machine hums, indifferent. She swallowed, her throat dry. The clock on the wall ticked. Another hour, another shift, another day. The air inside the Gary steel plant felt like a physical weight, a thick, shimmering curtain of heat, saturated with the scent of scale and machine oil. Linda stepped across the threshold of the main bay, and the atmosphere immediately pressed against her skin. Her heavy work boots vibrated with the rhythmic thud of hydraulic presses, a sound so deep it seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly at her ribs. High above, massive steel beams drifted on groaning chains, their shadows flickering across the floor like predatory birds. Sparks from distant welding stations rained down in orange cascades, reflecting briefly in the curved glass of her safety goggles before dying out against the soot-stained concrete. Gary breathed steam and iron dust. Linda adjusted the heavy leather belt of her coveralls, feeling the immediate prickle of sweat at her temples. Every movement of the machinery echoed inside her chest, a relentless, percussive reminder that this was more than a job. It was a daily siege. She moved through the bay with the practiced gait of someone who had long ago learned to navigate the chaos, her eyes scanning the floor for hazards that could break a limb in a heartbeat. She found a young worker at the control console of the secondary line, his hands hovering uncertainly over the switches. The conveyor had stuttered, a misalignment causing the metal housings to pile up like a logjam. Linda didn't wait for an explanation. She slammed her palm against the iron railing, the sound ringing out over the roar of the motors. "Move!" she barked, her voice a dry rasp that cut through the mechanical din. Her face burned with the heat of the shop, and the muscles in her jaw worked as she shoved the boy aside. She pointed toward the jammed housing, her fingers steady as a steel rod. "The cycle stops for no one. You clear it, or the whole shift goes to hell. Now." The boy shrank back under her gaze, his shoulders hunching as if to ward off a blow. Linda didn't offer comfort. Comfort was for people who lived outside these walls. Here, there was only the plan, the quota, and the ticking clock. She watched him scramble to fix the alignment, her grip tightening on the tablet that tracked every second of downtime. Discipline was the only thing keeping the plant from devouring itself, and that discipline rested on her shoulders. When the shift finally ended 12 hours later, the silence of the parking lot felt unnatural, a ringing void that made her ears ache. Linda climbed the creaking steps of her porch, her joints complaining with every inch of elevation. She reached into the narrow slot of the mailbox, pulling out a handful of colorful junk, supermarket coupons, credit card offers, the detritus of a consumer world she barely inhabited. Among the glossy trash, a thick envelope caught her eye. It bore the red stamp of a law firm, the paper crusted under her rough fingers as she tore it open. Her eyes darted across the lines, skipping the legalese to find the jagged teeth of the message. Mortgage arrears, foreclosure proceedings, eviction notice. The air seemed to vanish from her lungs. Linda leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, the peeling paint of her house suddenly feeling like a stranger's skin. For 20 years, this house had been the one thing she could count on, the fortress she'd built with every overtime hour and every bruised knuckle. Now, it was a liability, a countdown. She shoved the notice deep into the pocket of her jacket as the sound of Emily's laughter drifted from the kitchen. Her hands shook, a fine, frantic tremor she couldn't suppress until she balled them into fists. Inside, she stood over the kitchen sink, letting the cold water run over her wrists, trying to wash away the sudden, paralyzing cold that had settled in her marrow. She stared at the porcelain, seeing only the numbers of the debt. "I have to fix this. I have to find a way." She forced her face into a mask of normalcy, a practiced, hollow smile for the children, but her pulse hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. When Tom finally walked through the door an hour later, the mask slipped. She didn't wait for him to take off his coat. She met him in the narrow hallway, the space between them suddenly too small for the secrets he was carrying. She pulled the crumpled notice from her pocket and slammed it onto the dining table. Her finger jabbed at the bold, black ink of the law firm's header. "Explain this, Tom. Now." Tom tried to look away, his eyes darting toward the television, but Linda stepped into his line of sight, forcing him to look at her. Her voice was low, a dangerous vibration that carried the weight of the factory floor. "The mortgage hasn't been paid in 3 months. Where did the money go? I gave you the checks. I saw you take them." Tom squared his shoulders, a familiar, defensive posture he used when he was cornered. He let out a short, dismissive laugh that didn't reach his tired eyes. He picked up the paper, flicking it with a fingernail as if it were a piece of stray lint. "It's a mistake, Linda. Calm down. You know how the bank is. Clerical errors, computer glitches. I went down there last week, talked to the manager myself. It's handled." His voice was smooth, practiced. He even reached out to touch her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt like a betrayal. He started describing the fictional manager he'd spoken to, weaving a story about lost wire transfers and bank holidays. Linda stood perfectly still, watching the way his throat moved when he lied. the way his fingers drummed a frantic rhythm against the tabletop. "I'll go back tomorrow," he promised, his voice rising with a false sense of indignation. "I'll give them a piece of my mind. Don't you worry about it." Linda nodded slowly, letting her shoulders drop as if she believed him. She turned back to the stove, stirring the cooling soup, but her eyes remained fixed on his reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. She saw him wipe sweat from his forehead. She saw the way he avoided looking at the empty space where their car usually sat. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in her gut, a physical sensation that told her the man behind her was a stranger wearing her husband's face. She waited. She waited until the house was quiet, until the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled roar of the city. When she was sure Tom was in the shower, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the laptop. Her fingers flew across the keys, entering the password for their joint account. A password that hadn't changed in 10 years. The screen flared white, reflecting in her widened pupils. She scrolled through the transaction history, her breath hitching. The balance wasn't just low, it was decimated. There were dozens of ATM withdrawals, small amounts at first, then larger, frantic sums, all taken from machines located in a part of town she never visited. The college fund she'd painstakingly built for James was gone. The emergency savings were a memory. She pressed her palm over her mouth to stifle a cry of pure, unadulterated rage. The zeros on the screen stared back at her, cold and final. The next evening, Linda didn't go straight home. She clocked out of the plant, but instead of heading for her car, she ducked behind the corner of a brick warehouse, pulling her jacket tight against the gathering damp of the Gary twilight. She watched the parking lot until she saw Tom's old pickup pull out. She waited 5 seconds, then slid into her own vehicle, keeping her lights off as she followed him. The drive took her away from the neat, crumbling streets of their neighborhood and toward the old docks. The roads here were a graveyard of potholes and shattered glass, illuminated only by the occasional flickering street lamp. She kept a safe distance, her heart racing in sync with the engine's idle. Tom navigated the maze of industrial ruins with a familiarity that chilled her. He pulled up in front of a windowless building that had once been a cinema. A neon sign above the door depicted a hand of cards, the tubing buzzing with a sickly red glow. Linda watched him get out of the truck, his head snapping from side to side before he knocked on the heavy iron door. It opened briefly, venting a plume of blue smoke and a snatch of loud, frantic music, before swallowing him whole. Linda sat in the darkness of her car, the scent of rot and stagnant water drifting through the vents. The rage she had felt in the kitchen had transformed into something else. A sharp, icy resolve. She reached for the door handle, her movements deliberate. She stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, the wind biting at her face. She didn't hesitate. She walked toward that iron door with the stride of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She left the Linda McCoy who worried about groceries and school plays behind on the pavement. When she pushed the door open, the light of a dozen cheap chandeliers flooded her vision, and she stepped into a world where the only law was the next card. Inside the rusty hook, the air was a thick, choking fog of tobacco and desperation. Linda pushed through the crowd, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the center table. Tom was there. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes fixed on the spinning wheel of the roulette table with a feral intensity. She saw his hands, the hands that had once held her with such tenderness, trembling as they pushed a meager stack of plastic chips onto a red square. "No more bets," the croupier droned. The ball clattered against the wood, a dry, skeletal sound. It skipped over the red, danced on the black, and finally settled into the green zero. Linda watched the wooden rake sweep the table clean, taking the last of their life savings with it. Tom didn't move. He just stared at the empty felt, his mouth hanging open. Linda didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She simply walked up behind him and sank her fingers into the meat of his shoulder, her grip like a vice. Tom jumped, his head whipping around, and when his eyes met hers, the blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. "Linda," he whispered, his voice cracking. I can explain. The odds, they were..." She didn't let him finish. She pointed at the table, her voice a low, vibrating hiss that was louder than any shout. "You threw it away. You threw James's future into a hole in the ground." She began to back him toward the wall, her presence taking up all the air in his lungs. Tom fumbled for words, his hands rising to ward her off, babbling about jackpots and one big win that would fix everything. Linda slammed her fist against the wall inches from his ear, the sound like a gunshot. "There is no win, Tom. There's only the debt. And now there's the street." She turned to pull him toward the exit, but the path was blocked. A man built like a mountain, wearing a leather vest that strained against his chest, stepped into their way. He smelled of old sweat and cheap cologne, and his hand, as large as a dinner plate, landed squarely on Linda's chest, stopping her mid-stride. "He owes," the man rumbled, his voice a deep bass that vibrated in Linda's teeth. He nodded toward Tom, who was trying to shrink into the shadows. "Last week's tab didn't just go away because you showed up, lady." From the shadows behind the bar, a man in a silk shirt stepped forward, adjusting his gold cufflinks. This was Harris. Iron. Matt Harris. He circled them like a shark, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. He looked Linda up and down, his gaze lingering on the rough skin of her hands and the fire in her eyes. "Mrs. McCoy, I presume," Harris said, his voice smooth as oil. "Your husband has been very ambitious. Unfortunately, his ambition exceeded his luck." He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive cigars clinging to him. "We have a few ways to settle this. I could take the deed to that charming little house of yours. Or perhaps you'd like to stay a while. We have private rooms upstairs for guests who are flexible." Linda felt a surge of nausea, followed by a heat so intense it felt like the furnaces at the plant. She didn't look at Tom. She looked directly at Harris, her eyes like chips of flint. "You'll get your money," she said, her voice steady. "But you won't get me, and you won't get the house. Not like this." In one swift motion, she grabbed Tom's wrist and yanked him toward the door, her strength surprising even the guard. She didn't look back until they were on the threshold. She turned to Harris, her voice ringing out over the silent room. "I'll find a way to pay. But if you touch my family again, you'll find out exactly what happens when a steelworker stops caring about the rules." She shoved Tom out into the night air, the heavy door clanging shut behind them. They drove in silence, the only sound the ragged breathing of a man who had lost everything and the grim determination of a woman who was just beginning to fight. But the morning brought a new kind of silence. When they approached the plant at dawn, the usual roar of the turbines was missing. A crowd of workers in gray coveralls stood outside the massive iron gates, their faces grim in the gray light. A fresh sign had been chained to the bars, the black letters stark against the white background. Production ceased indefinitely. Linda stood at the gate, her fingers curled around the cold iron. The smokestacks, usually the lungs of the city, were dead. Tom stood beside her, his keys hitting the gravel with a soft chink. The fog from the lake rolled in, thick and suffocating, turning the massive factory into a tomb. She pushed through the crowd to the bulletin board, her eyes scanning the list of layoffs. She found her name near the top. McCoy, Linda, supervisor, terminated. The paper crumpled in her fist. The last thread had snapped. They returned home to find a yellow tow truck idling in their driveway. Two men in jumpsuits were already hooking chains to the bumper of their car. Linda ran from the truck, shouting, her voice raw with desperation. "Stop! You can't do this. We have a grace period." The collector didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Grace period's over, ma'am. Orders from the bank." The metal hook screeched against the frame of the car, a sound that made Linda's teeth ache. She saw the curtains in the neighbor's house twitch. Tom stayed in the truck, his face buried in his hands. He couldn't even look at the shame he'd brought to their doorstep. Linda grabbed the collector's arm, trying to pull him away from the winch, but he shoved her back with a grunt of annoyance. "Don't make this harder, lady. It's just a car." "It's my life," she screamed. But the car was already being hoisted into the air. She stood on the empty driveway, watching the taillights of their transportation disappear around the corner, leaving her in a world that was rapidly shrinking to the size of a coffin. Inside the house, the silence was broken by Tom's sudden, explosive rage. He threw his jacket across the room, his face twisted with a resentment that had been brewing for years. "Are you happy now?" he yelled, his voice echoing off the walls of the kitchen. "You followed me. You humiliated me in front of those people. You've always treated me like a child, Linda. No wonder I went there. No wonder I wanted to feel like a man for once." Linda didn't answer. She stood by the window, watching a second car pull up, a sedan this time. Two men in suits got out and began walking toward the garage, clipboards in hand. They were starting the inventory. They were taking the mower, the tools, the very bones of their existence. She turned to look at Tom. He was still shouting, still blaming her, still trying to make his weakness her fault. He looked small. He looked pathetic. The man she had married was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out shell. "Shut up, Tom," she said, her voice so quiet it cut through his shouting like a knife. "Just shut up." The phone in her pocket vibrated. She pulled it out and saw a photo. It was James and Emily standing at the school bus stop. In the background, partially obscured, was a black SUV with tinted windows. Below the photo was a text. "The sun is setting, Linda. Tick-tock." The ice in her veins turned to fire. She walked over to Tom, grabbed him by the collar, and slammed him against the kitchen cabinets. The dishes inside rattled, a fragile domestic sound in a moment of pure violence. "They have the kids," she hissed, her face inches from his. "Harris has the kids. Tell me everything, every cent, every paper you signed, now, or I swear to God, I'll leave you for the collectors." Tom broke. The words poured out of him, a litany of bad decisions, high-interest loans, and a second mortgage he'd forged her signature on. He'd gambled away the house. He'd gambled away their lives. Linda didn't wait to hear the end. She dragged him toward the old work van in the garage, the one vehicle the collectors hadn't found yet. She drove like a madwoman through the industrial wasteland, the tires screaming on the turns. She headed back to the plant, to the one place she knew better than anyone. They entered through the fire escape, the heavy door groaning as it swung open. The cutting bay was a cathedral of rust and shadows, the air tasting of old iron and fear. Linda led him into the center of the floor, the silence of the dead factory pressing in on them. "You did this," she said, her voice booming in the empty space. "You put our children in a cage for a game of cards." Tom roared, a sound of pure, agonizing frustration. He picked up a length of rebar from the floor and began smashing it against the control panel of a nearby machine. Glass shattered, the shards flying through the air like diamonds. He struck the metal again and again, his hands bleeding, his breath coming in ragged sobs. Linda watched him, her heart cold. The destruction changed nothing. A beam of light swept across the high windows of the bay. A black SUV pulled into the yard, its engine a low, predatory growl. Linda saw the GPS tracker blinking on the dashboard of her own van. She'd led them right to her. She moved with the efficiency of a machine. She shoved a steel bar through the handles of the main door, barricading them in. She heard the SUV doors click shut. She heard footsteps on the concrete outside. "Linda?" Harris's voice drifted through the metal, calm and conversational. "Don't make this a fire. I'd hate to ruin such a historic building. Just come out and we can discuss the new terms." She smelled it then. The sharp, chemical scent of gasoline being poured under the door. She didn't panic. She went to her supervisor's locker and pulled out an old flare gun. She checked the load, the orange plastic bright in the gloom. She grabbed Tom, pulling him out from behind the crates where he was cowering, and shoved a heavy wrench into his hand. "Stand up," she commanded. "Look them in the eye." The door groaned as a crowbar bit into the frame. The metal screamed, then gave way. Harris walked in, silhouetted against the moonlight, his two thugs flanking him. He flicked a lighter, the flame dancing in the draft. Linda stepped forward, out of the shadows, and leveled the flare gun at his chest. Her hand was as steady as the girders above them. "Stop," she said. Harris laughed, but he didn't move. "A flare gun, Linda? Really? It'll burn hot enough to melt your suit to your skin before your boys can draw," she said. "But I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to negotiate." She reached into her coveralls and pulled out a blue folder, the one she'd taken from the foreman's office months ago when she'd suspected the plant was being bled dry. It contained the records of the consulting fees the plant had been paying to a shell company owned by Harris. It was money laundering on a massive scale, involving the city council and the union leadership. "The digital copies are already set to send to the DA in 60 minutes, she said. "Unless I check in." Harris's smile vanished. The silence in the bay was absolute. "You rip up the notes," Linda said, her voice like iron. "You put the McCoy name on your black list. You never look at my children again. And I'll forget I ever saw these papers." Harris stared at her for a long time. He looked at the flare gun, then at the folder, then at the woman standing in the ruins of her life. He reached out, took the folder, and flipped through the pages. His face went gray. He turned to his men. "Get in the car." He looked at Linda one last time. "You're wasted in this town, Mrs. McCoy." When the SUV sped away, Linda let the flare gun drop. She sank onto the concrete, her back against a cold machine. And finally, she let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. Tom fell to his knees beside her, sobbing, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Linda looked at him. "Tomorrow, you go to the clinic in the city. I've already called them. And you sign the house over to me. Everything. You don't get a cent until the kids are through school." She stood up and walked toward the door, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The factory was still dead, the city was still broken, and the debts were still there. But as she stepped out into the cold air, she felt the weight of her own strength. She wasn't a victim of the system. She was the one who survived it. She sat on her porch later that morning, a cup of bitter coffee in her hand. The street was quiet. The collectors were gone. The house was hers, for now. She looked at her hands, the grease, the scars, the history. She took a sip of the coffee and watched the sun rise over the rust. She was Linda McCoy, and she was still standing.